From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across our continent. These were the words of former Prime Minister Winston Churchill speaking at a graduation ceremony in Fulton, Missouri, 1946 in the USA. He was referring to the unprecedented expansion of Soviet control over Eastern Europe following the Second World War. Today, on the History Chronicles, we will be looking at the closing of the Iron Curtain and the opening stages of the Cold War. By 1948, only 4 years after the fall of Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union had secured a vast sphere of influence across Eastern Europe. Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. By 1948, all of these countries were dominated by communist governments, which were in turn held to account by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. But each country held its own story. Some areas of Eastern Europe had been sympathetic to communism. Other countries were controlled by means of manipulation, some by out-and-out intimidation. Let's start off by looking at that country that the Soviet Union itself had invaded right in the first stages of World War II, Poland. At the beginning of the Second World War, the USSR, allied with Nazi Germany and the Nazi-Soviet Pact, had launched a massive invasion of Poland. This invasion consisted of 7 field armies on the Soviet side and included up to 1 million soldiers. Together, Stalin and Hitler divided Poland between them. Poland had been a long-term bone of contention for the Soviet Union. The armistice of World War I had annulled the Russian treaty with the Central Powers, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and resulted in a Russian invasion of Poland and subsequent war that lasted until 1921. These hostilities were concluded with the Peace of Riga, an agreement between the Russians and the Poles that placed a large number of Russian-speaking Slavic people inside an expanded Polish border. The repatriation of these Slavic peoples could therefore provide some justification for the consequent Soviet invasion. Perhaps more importantly, a Soviet-controlled Poland would act as a buffer state to any invasion coming from Central Europe. By 1945, Poland had been fully occupied by the USSR as its soldiers marched through the country in their final push against Nazi Germany. This time, Germany was the enemy, having instigated a massive land operation against the Soviet Union in 1941. Now, after a faltering campaign on the Eastern Front from 1942, the Germans were on the retreat. Poland was once more a battlefield. By the end of the war, 1/3 of Polish national wealth had disappeared. 1 in 5 Poles had been killed. Millions were left in a desperate struggle to find their families and return to their homes. It had been agreed among the Allies at the Potsdam Conference that the USSR was entitled to annex parts of former eastern Poland. In order to make space for the Poles that were displaced, over 6 million Germans were subsequently forced out of their homes. Part of a so-called population displacement in which the USSR, together with the USA, Britain and France, were all agreed. At the end of World War II, Poland was left with 2 governments. The one in exile, based in London, had little real power on the ground in Poland. Here, Soviet troops remained after liberation from the Nazis and helped to ensure the Soviet-supported Communist Party had their way. In the subsequent elections in January 1947, the Communist Party were able to claim 80% of the vote. Soviet influence was secure in this key buffer state of Europe. While Poland had been the first victim of Nazi Germany in World War II, other countries in Eastern Europe had sought alliances with Hitler's Third Reich. Romania, Bulgaria and Hungary had been Germany's allies in the East. As such, they were to face harsh judgment by the Soviet forces that conquered and occupied them as the war turned against Germany. The King of Romania, Carol II, started the war under the flag of neutrality. Political pressure from fascists inside the country, called the Iron Guard, had resulted in an alliance with the Nazis in 1940. The rise of the Iron Guard's leader, Antonescu, had forced the abdication of Carol II, putting his son Michael onto the Romanian throne. Ironically, it was this young king who was to launch a coup against the pro-fascist government in 1944, when it was clear that the war was going badly for Germany and her allies. In recognition of this, Romania was recognised as a former ally of Hitlerite Germany by the Allies in 1945, but a country that had latterly acted in the interests of the United Nations. Soviet occupation following the war, however, helped to establish a Soviet government. This was done rather cleverly in Romania's case, with the Soviets first accepting a coalition government in 1945 with the existing Romanian regime. This was facilitated at the behests of the Allied Control Commission, an organisation that had been set up in the aftermath of World War II to manage the reconstruction of European governments that had fallen victim to the war. The Communist Romanian Workers' Party that had been banned before 1945 was now allowed back into politics. This so-called coalition with the existing government soon developed into a single-party state dominated by communism. Rigged elections in 1946 gave communists over 90% of the vote. A gradual takeover of the police was instigated on the communists' behalf, with a show trial of the main opposition leaders taking place in October 1947. By December of that year, King Michael himself was forced to abdicate. The People's Republic of Romania was declared in the ashes of the Romanian monarchy. The People's Republic of Bulgaria was created in a similar way. The Bulgarian king had formed a tentative alliance with Nazi Germany during World War II. This was undone in a communist coup in 1944 when the Red Army had entered Bulgarian territory. This government was led by a group called the Fatherland Front, which initially formed a coalition with existing political groups that were less extreme in nature. Gradually, however, opponents to communism met a similar fate to those in Romania. The People's Militia, a communist group, began to terrorise non-communist opponents of the Fatherland Front. In February 1945, the Prince Regent and former Prime Minister Bogdan Filov were arrested, along with hundreds of other officials from the former regime. They were charged with treason and executed for their war crimes under the Nazis. The Bulgarian monarchy itself was abolished with a plebiscite in 1946. Following this, communists took power with formal elections in October 1946, giving them a majority in government. A new constitution was drafted in 1947 which effectively put an end to any form of multi-party democracy that had existed before. The Bulgarian Orthodox Church, a centuries-old foundation that had strongly supported the monarchy, was allowed to function but was severely curtailed in its freedoms. Other religious groups in Bulgaria, as was the case in much of Eastern Europe under communism, were restricted or even banned. Like Bulgaria and Romania, Hungary had also seen a lurch to the right of politics in the 1930s. The long-term impact of the First World War, coupled with the economic strain of the Great Depression, had made the political climate in Hungary ripe for fascism. The Hungarian Prime Minister before the war had eventually been removed by political opponents who demonstrated that his grandfather was a Jew. The new government, under Pál Teleki, trod a fine line between the Third Reich and the Allies. The government was pretty much anti-Semitic and implemented harsh racial laws and restrictions that were similar to those put forward by the Nazi Third Reich. On its foreign policy, however, Teleki had different ideas. He wished to keep Hungary at a distance from the growing power of expansionist Germany. Following its conquest of Czechoslovakia in 1938 and the alliance with Austria, the German government demanded that Hungary participate in an invasion of Yugoslavia in 1940. While he deliberated, Teleki's power was eventually undone by one of his generals, Henrik Wirth, who agreed with the German High Command that Hungary would facilitate access to German troops for the Yugoslav invasion. Teleki, who had promised Yugoslavia no such thing in a treaty of non-aggression the previous year, was devastated. He committed suicide on the 3rd of April 1941. The new government participated more fully in the war, suffering devastating losses in Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. In September 1944, the Red Army reached the Hungarian border. The new Prime Minister, Miklos Horthy, asked for an armistice, but he was ignored. After a coup that was instigated with the kidnapping of Horthy's son, a more pro-Nazi Prime Minister was installed, Ferenc Szálasi. Under Szálasi's leadership, the Hungarian government continued to pursue the Nazi agenda, leading mass anti-Semitic deportations and pogroms across the country, even as Soviet troops were fighting through Hungary. By the end of 1944, Hungary was fully occupied by the Soviet Union. Its defeated army had retreated into Germany. There was little support for communism in Hungary at the end of the war. Elections held in 1945 garnered communists only 17% of the vote. From this, however, communists obtained control of the Ministry of the Interior, and another rigged election in 1947 gave them control of the government. With this power, Soviet supporters were able to discredit and persecute their political opponents through the courts and the secret police, called the Alam Vedelmi, Ostaldi, or AVO. This was to become one of the most hated engines of the Soviet-backed regime. The leader of the AVO in 1945 was an Hungarian who had been trained by the NKVD, the precursor of the KGB. This man, Gabor Peter, stirred up accusations against opponents to communism by associating them with the former Nazi regime in Hungary. Even Peter's boss, a man called Laszlo Rajk, who was head of the Ministry of the Interior, was accused of plotting a coup against the Hungarian Communist government in 1948. Following torture and forced confession, Rajk was sentenced to death and executed. The Communist Party merged with the other main party in Hungary, the Social Democrats, in 1948. This was, in effect, another Soviet-backed takeover that consolidated Stalin's grip on the eastern part of Europe after the war. In contrast to the regimes that had supported the war, Czechoslovakia, like Poland, had been one of Nazi Germany's first conquests. In 1938, the Wehrmacht had stormed their way across the Czech border in the rapid blitzkrieg that was to prove so successful in the early stages of the war. Czechs had resisted the Nazi onslaught, but, with little help from Britain and France at this point, President Edvard Beneš was soon forced to form a government in exile. Under Nazi occupation, former Czechoslovakia was dismembered, becoming the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia and the Slovak Republic, both under Nazi rule. Upon its liberation by the Soviets in 1945, therefore, the soldiers of the USSR actually had some support from the Czechs. Once the war was over, Czechoslovakia welcomed back its former leader, Edvard Beneš, who was prepared to cooperate with Stalin. Soviet troops left, and post-war elections resulted in the formation of a balanced government, ruled by a coalition where the Communist Party was one of 6 political groups in power. However, even here in Czechoslovakia, where there had been some strong support for communism, brutal tactics began to crush any opposition to communist rule. In May 1947, a popular non-communist politician, Jan Marek, was murdered. Gradually, communists assumed key positions in government ministries, allowing them to arrest political opponents. Following the United States' offer of martial aid to countries across Europe, Stalin tightened his grip still further on any notion of Czech independence. By February 1948, all non-communist members of the government had resigned, facing pressure by their Soviet-backed communist counterparts. Communists stepped up to fill the vacancies created. 3 years later, in 1951, even high-ranking communists themselves fell foul of the accusations from within. Following an argument with the communist prime minister, the party general secretary, Randolph Slansky, and a number of other communists were accused of conspiracy against the state and executed. It was clear that any form of dissent against the party line would not be tolerated. On August 12, 1942, Winston Churchill, the very same man who was going to give the Iron Curtain speech a few years later in America, arrived in Moscow. He was here at the height of the war, when the Third Reich threatened British security and that of the Soviet Union. Churchill was depending on the Soviet Union to keep up the fight in the east. Stalin, in turn, was to push the Allies for an assault in the west, to relieve the immense pressure that the Red Army faced on the Eastern Front. In the midst of 3 tense days of deliberation, Churchill wrote on a scrap of paper the amount of territory that he was prepared to cede to the Soviets once the war was over. The amounts were written in percentages. Romania, 90% Russian. Greece, 10% Russian, 90% Western. Yugoslavia, 50% Russian. Hungary, 50% Russian. Bulgaria, 50% Russian. The leaders of these countries were not present at this exchange, and this agreement, this piece of paper, was not ratified by the Americans, nor did it go on to determine the Allied position after the war. Indeed, so hesitant was Churchill about dealing with such significant matters in this way that he proposed they burn the paper. Stalin declined. This scrap of paper, known as the Percentages Agreement, was historic. It showed that, even in the midst of the Allied fight against the Nazi regime, it was clear to Churchill that the Soviet contribution to the war necessitated the acquisition of territory in Eastern Europe. Back in that graduation speech in Fulton, Missouri, 1946, it was clear to Churchill once more that his imaginings of Soviet expansion had now become a harsh reality. The Iron Curtain had fallen. Thank you very much for watching this episode of the History Chronicles. I hope you enjoyed it. Please do subscribe, put on the notifications button, and do support our Patreon page, which you can find below. See you next time.